and interactive. There are hosts here tonight providing the food, beverages. HR would love it if I made some job announcements, but that's a little bit boring. So mostly we're doing this though just for tech purposes, getting helping out the community. We're fully open source stack, so we just want to give back how we can, and this is one of the ways. And there's an after party tonight over at 21st Amendment, Engine Yard and Orchestra IO. They're buying beers and stuff for 2 hours. Helgi there is going to help us out with that. They also have a 30-day pass they're giving out at ey.io/EYSFPHP. Think of EY as in Engine Yard. As usual, O'Reilly with the books, so we're going to give away a bunch of those tonight. Just a heads up that on Google+, if you're a fan of that, Rasmus set up a PHP page today, so you can follow PHP on there now. I will be sending out an update soon about the logo contest. That's just kind of behind the times, basically, just because of all the hassle that happened this year. The people that submitted, we'll get them some books, and then we'll figure out something else to do with the logo after that. On December 15th, we're going to have a talk about Zen 402. So they're making quite a lot of really big changes. So we'll have an overview of some of those big changes. Nick and John over there. Zen Framework, sorry. Yeah, that's mixing up with another project that I'm on. So that's kind of the gist of what's going on tonight. And with that, he's with Automatic, and you know it as WordPress. He'll be talking about living without your linemen. So there we go.
Can everyone hear me? Okay, I couldn't get the remote working, so I'm going to be standing. I normally like pace or whatever. So you guys already heard the abstract, so I should first go into who am I. I'm a PHP programmer. So when I was at ZenCon, which is a PHP conference in 2006, the host Zend, which is PHP, made one of these, and it was basically all of these PHP developers on a deck of cards. I kind of looked at it, it was like 2000s, mid-2000s, so I kind of looked at it and I realized that if they put your face on a deck of cards like that, then you're a terrorist. So I started telling people that I was a PHP terrorist. And if some of what I say shocks you or seems a little bit extreme, then you've already been warned. And that gets me back to a different presentation, which is during a number of years ago, I said this. What I meant to say was when I created the website, but I said the web, and pretty soon I'm like Al Gore. And that led a bunch of PHP developers to create a website called Cheism, which if you go to phpdoc.info/Cheism, there's some of my, I guess, wisdom. Some of these things apparently actually did come out of my mouth. I don't remember that. But also, if you go to the PHP IRC channel on any of the PHP IRC robots will say this. Anytime you say my name, it will spit out one of these. And here's another one. Apparently, I didn't need to drive to get here. A keynote transition was enough. That's basically my last keynote transition. Instead, I want to just talk about a story in 3 parts. And each part I'm going to preface each part with a kind of little anecdote or story vignette on the side. So the first vignette I want to talk about is PHP Advent 2009. I wrote an article called 1500 Lines of Code for Christmas. And what it's about is that a few startups ago, I worked with a guy who was a better programmer than any of us. We got into an argument over a piece of code that he took written in Python that he rewrote and imported it to C++. And he was telling me how much faster he made it. And I asked, well, what's the point? Because now that you've rewritten it, you kind of own the maintenance of doing that. And there was no evidence that this piece of code, which was some import code, was a bottleneck on anything, so it really didn't matter according to Ondel's law. So his point was the code was crap, and he fixed it, and it's a massive amount of efficiency improvement. And I said, well, look, you're right. You know, it's true. I use a crappy, underperformant language like PHP, and he can crank out C++ like John Henry. And he's like this dude with like 2 hammers hammering away, but I'm like this dude with the jackhammer when I use PHP. It's not super efficient. But the difference is there's only one John Henry. There's like a gajillion people like me. And it was related to this, which is, when I worked at a startup in 2002, I realized I would integrate. I was the director of engineering, so I slept under my desk. And during the daytime, I would code. And at night, I would integrate everyone's changes that they put into CVS so it actually would work. And looking at everyone's changes, including mine, I realized that the engineer on their best days were writing about 1,500 lines of code per day max. And I've just lived by that, is that you as a programmer can only express yourself in at most 1,500 lines of code. And I would tell this, and I had a friend who said, well, except for Java. He's like, in a GTE programmer only writes 5 lines of code per day. And then he said, but they're really good lines, you know. He was a Java guy. And so it led to this thing, you know, life is too short for Java because it only takes 3 years to put in a hard day's work. What does 1,500 lines of code mean? It means, to put it in real terms, here's a book. We have to put that number in terms that we can understand. So in this book called Outliers, which is a very popular book from 2008, Malcolm Gladwell makes a point that it takes about 10,000 hours of diligent practice to achieve mastery in anything. If you want to be a chess master, practice 10,000 hours. You want to be a great golfer, practice 10,000 hours. A violinist, pianist, physicist, it doesn't matter. You need to put about 10,000 hours. And I saw everyone was reading that book and they were tweeting, oh, you know, I have this thing I want to do. All I have to do is put in 10K hours after reading that section in Gladwell's book. And that's on purpose. See, Gladwell stole that idea from this book, Talent is Overrated. But he deliberately, because he's Malcolm Gladwell, misrepresents how many hours 10,000 hours is. It's not just, and by the way, it's not just any practice, it's diligent practice. It's not something you can just do, it's something that nobody wants to do. If they like to practice the piano, then we'd have tons of master piano people, but nobody likes to practice the piano the way a great pianist does, or play the cello the way Yo-Yo Ma does. It's just too much work. And you can't do that many hours. So in this book, it's 10 years of work, working 20 hours a week, which is basically half your work hours. You can't do really more because it's diligent practice. For 10 years is how you achieve mastery, whether you're Tiger Woods, Bobby Fischer, or Yo-Yo Ma. Similarly, 1,500 lines of code, if you break it down, a 500,000 line code base, which is like a decent sized piece of software, is performing at your peak day every day for 1 year straight is what it would take to write just an average piece of software. So it's not small. It's not a small task to say that, you know, 1,500 lines of code and all of a sudden I'm churning out all this amazing shit. You can't do that. So when we write these lines of code, and my argument against him is not that C++ is inferior or anything like that. It's an extremely performant language. It's just that when you write a line of PHP, it maybe powers like, say, anywhere from like 15 lines of assembly code to thousands of lines of assembly code if you're calling a library. If you write a line of C++, it may be only powering on average about 3 lines of assembly code. So that 1,500 lines that I'm writing is doing a lot more work than what his is doing. He can write it much more performant, but that's what it is. So when I'm a PHP developer, I'm trying to be most efficient with it. So either we choose how to spend how we spend our time to write code wisely, or we end up getting a lot of minions to write our code for us. Those are our options. Maybe. I think it's just weird, noisy type thing. Here, I switched it to the other side, so maybe it's... So let's go to part 1, 3 observations. The first observation is site ops, system operations, or system administration. They're like your linemen, your offensive line. This is an analogy that Mariano, one of the co-hosts at SFPHP, once told me when we were co-workers in 2007. He's like, Terry, look at it. You're like the architect, and you're like the quarterback. I'm a programmer, so I'm like the running back or the wide receiver. I never really got him to tell me what the difference was between running back and wide receiver. I assume one's the front-end engineer and the other's a back-end engineer, but I never really got it straight. But he told me, but systems are like the offensive line. Site ops is the big burly guys up front that make you look good. So what we should do is go down and say, go to specialties, which I did every site ops day. I'd go to specialties, buy them a bunch of baked goods, and give it to them, because you have to keep your linemen happy if you're the quarterback. And because site ops is kind of a frustrating deal, because 90% of the questions that they have to answer are easily answered as, have you tried turning the computer off and on again? Or other things is like people are constantly asking me as the architect, what are they doing? They don't seem to be working at all. And the answer is, well, you don't want to see them working, because if they're working, that means some shit went down and life sucks. So just like linemen, offensive linemen, you don't want to see them. If you see them, then they probably got called for a holding penalty. And we live in a world of offensive, where our site ops are our offensive line. The second observation is a story on Ruby on Rails. And there's a guy out there. He's, according to Wired Magazine, the hottest hacker on earth. He should remain nameless in this case. I don't want to bring up his name, so we'll just call him DHH for short. And this guy is like the Jesus of the Ruby world, if Jesus shaved off his beard and started dressing like a hipster. And he only has 2 words for me and you, and that is, fuck you. And it's in all his talks. He ends his talk with, if you have any problem with me, I only have these 2 words for you. And of course, I have lots of problems with Ruby, so these are words for me. And it's not, it's the gospel according to David. And it's not like I haven't been known to swear on occasion. Sometimes you could probably replace my talks with a recording of me saying fuckity fuck, 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 and it would be just as good. I mean, most of my talks have an explicit tag put next to them in the program. But I think there's a world of difference between me saying things like this, coding these web apps sometimes involves a lot of swearing, a lot of blood, sweat, and swear, and something like this, fuck you. Because when someone says this to you or me or anyone, they're ending debate. It's so easy. Like, for instance, maybe someone says, like, I can't run Rails in mod Ruby on Apache on a shared host because it has a memory collision issue because of the shared memory segments, and therefore it doesn't work. So I can't use Rails on shared hosts. And Jesus' answer to this is, fuck you. Or maybe read writes on websites don't grow or scale evenly with Moore's law, because Moore's law is a time-based thing, 18 months, and my site doesn't grow double magically every 18 months. So I can't use Moore's law to solve my problem. And his answer is, fuck you. And fuck you is like the your mama of the Rails world. I mean, it's basically the catch-all response to any sort of problem you've ever run into. The answer is, fuck you. And it's not like I don't give directed fucks. Like, for instance, my internet goes down at home, and I say, fuck Comcast. And, well, actually, it doesn't go down, because according to Cheism, my laptop was just in sleep mode. And every time I use my cell phone in San Francisco, right, when I upgraded to Lion, and really Apple should be thanking me, because apparently there's no spyware because it's afraid of me. And even against PHP, I give a directed fuck. You know, every time I do that. And 2 months ago, Rasmus explained why this is there. So, you know, in some ways I blame Rasmus for actually basing his stuff on C. And C is an incredibly esoteric language. So maybe it's not my fault that I direct this at PHP. Well, maybe then it is, because I beat the internet with only one court. But my argument with Ruby on Rails is that it's a type of framework, and I believe most architectural frameworks are stuck between a rock and a hard place. The rock in this case is the Pareto principle, which states that 80% of your effects come from 20% of your causes. That means 80% of your time when you start maintaining an app will be spent only on 20% of your code. And that 20% of the code is the part that the framework doesn't handle. You know, when you're fixing a bug, I guarantee that bug over time is a part that isn't in your framework. If it is in that framework, you're in big trouble, right? So you better hope it's not, or you're in a big case. So framework is building the 80% of your code base that's not going to take that much of your time to build in the long term. It's not where your problems are. And maybe, and the rock in this case is that maybe something pre-built already solves your problem. I once said, this is years ago, in 2005, Ruby is really good at what it does. The problem for what Ruby on Rails does really well, I can download WordPress, and now I work there, to solve most of those problems. And that's the issue I have with, it's not that there's anything wrong with Rails, it's just that you have to consider that the problem space it's navigating is stuck between these two solutions. Solutions that are better off rolling your own if you're a Facebook in the Pareto principle, or just installing a pre-built solution that already solves that problem if your thing is mappable to something like a blog or CMS or any of these sort of tools. So basically, that given that Ruby on Rails is a framework and frameworks have this property, the transitive property of fails means that Rails fails. So how was I wrong? Well, I was wrong because of this Harvard Business School book, which is known as the Innovator's Dilemma. And this guy, it's full of shit, by the way, but this guy brings up an idea called disruptive technology. So if you ever heard the word disruptive technology and you wondered what it is, you have to go back to this book to really understand it. And here's the definition in the book. It's a really gibberish definition. And it basically, what it means is that hard drive, if you look at hard drives as his example, they went smaller and smaller from like, you know, whatever inch to 8 inch, from 8 inch to 5 1/4, from 5 1/4 to 3 1/2. And each time these guys who were making, say, 8-inch drives didn't give a crap about the 5 1/4 because the 5 1/4s were inferior in almost every way. They were more expensive, they had less storage in every other way, but for some reason, some feature of that allowed it to beat it. And that's the same way like mainframes to mini-frames, mini-frames to workstations, workstations to PCs, etc. Sears itself was dominant and Walmart took over with an inferior product. What goes on here is these companies do not fail because they're incompetent at what they do. They fail because they miss something called a disruptive technology. They miss an appearance of a new technology because that technology is inferior. In other words, the shorter version of this definition is this disruptive technology is that which sucks, and Rails certainly does. So that's why you think it's disruptive. It's a little ironic because most of the book was written in 97 or revised in 97, and most of the examples he gives of possible disruptive technology since it was the height of the dot-com boom are now in the dead pool. So obviously that's just a feature of it because it looks inferior. You have no idea if it's going to succeed or not. And so you might be thinking, oh, Ruby on Rails is disruptive. But no, that's not it. What is disruptive is this, is that same year I was saying this sort of stuff, a company called Amazon had released previous year S3 and was releasing EC2. They were making cloud hosting or cloud computing. And the same day my face was on a bunch of terrorist deck from Zend was when Amazon was announcing the launch of EC2, and I was interviewed by the creator of that deck, Cal, and he asked me what I thought the most interesting thing at the conference was, and this is my words. Basically, I think EC2 was the most interesting thing because it's clearly disruptive. And what do I mean? Well, first of all, cloud computing is inferior to shared hosting, to co-location or what have you in their space. It's more expensive, but it has intrinsic properties that's going to dominate. Examples of that is just looking historically, the flash memory is disruptive. So initially, flash memory is inferior to it, and Jobs was out there when the iPod came out in 2002 saying flash is dead. You know, there were flash players long before the iPod, and flash is nothing until the next year, 2005 rolls around, and he's coming out with the Shuffle, and we have the iPhone today, which uses flash RAM. See, flash at the time, it's not like he was wrong. He's just saying at the time, which was 2004, flash is an inferior technology, but he clearly saw it as disruptive because the very next year he comes out with the Shuffle. Because it offers a different set of attributes from the mainstream. In this case, it doesn't crash, you know, it's not a moving part, and other advantages. So eventually it supplants the existing system. And we see that in the case of shared hosting and managed hosting and co-location. We see things like Amazon Web Services being the beginning of an explosion in this sort of infrastructure as a service. Sure, it starts out worse, but we see that its attributes are so far different from any other hosting we've ever seen or co-location that eventually it's going to supplant the existing system. And that's what I mean. Rails succeeds because it sucks. What happened is Rails can't do the shared hosting. I mentioned that because of the Apache collision. So they have to have a virtual machine to run a Rails instance. So therefore they're going to adopt EC2 in droves because there is no real cost-efficient shared solution to it. And if cloud computing becomes big, which it has, then they're going to ride that train to a new form of success. And we see that whether it's Capistrano or Ruby Cruise Control or GitHub or Heroku. We see all of these sort of things, and it owes its strength to the disruption of infrastructure as a service. Here's one example. This is a Ruby port of a Java application that allows continuous integration of your code base, so continuous testing of your code as it's checked in. It's called Cruise Control, and cruisecontrol.rb is very popular. Another example is Capistrano. What Capistrano does is it automates your cloud deployments for you, so you can basically manage your deployments on your cloud infrastructure through this. This is written in Ruby or Rails. I can't remember which. I get them confused. And then Vagrant is automated virtualization hardware So it basically builds your VM boxes for you, your virtual machine instances for you. And then when you do, you use Puppet to actually configure those VM instances for whatever your needs are. All of these are built in Ruby. And then another quintessential example is the adoption and introduction of GitHub. They adopted Git in droves. Us in the PHP world, we just migrated the PHP core to Subversion. That's how backwards we were, and still are. See, Ruby allowed people to do very stupid things, like try to make MapReduce in Rails without a reduce function. But that attitude allows them to adopt new things that may turn out to succeed, like infrastructure as service or Git. And they have huge success. An example of that in the cloud is Heroku or Engine Yard, which bought out Orchestra, which I'll mention later. These are instances where you basically install your app in GitHub, and then you just point you log into Heroku or Engine Yard, and you point it to your GitHub install, and it builds out virtual servers for you. It builds out your website straight from your code base, all in the cloud. So the third story is the story of PHP. And PHP has its own S3. Simplicity, scalability, and straightforwardness. This is the reason why everyone chooses PHP. One of these three things or all of them. What do I mean by simplicity? I mean basically any moron can learn it. Philip Greenspun once wrote, he was teaching a class at MIT and Harvard. He noticed that among his students, a project done in Java costs 5 times as much and takes twice as long and will be harder to maintain than a project done in a scripting language like PHP. What do I mean by scalable? I mean shared nothing, which Rasmus is talking about. But basically, PHP doesn't give you anything to hang your neck on. You can basically, all that stuff that can't scale, PHP doesn't give you, so therefore it's scalable because it doesn't give you the crap that can't scale. And straightforward means that it's an ugly language, but it's very straightforward. The needle haystack problem is just based on the C code, C functions that it's modeled after. And PHP is not about the purity of CS principles or architecture. Rasmus wrote that if you want that, get out of PHP before you get hit by a wet cat. In other words, if you look at simplicity, scalability, straightforwardness, each of those show that PHP succeeds because it sucks. It's the dirty little secret of web development. Anyone can string together select star from users their email and question mark. It's not that hard. So if you boil down S3 into a single S, it's that it sucks. But that suckiness creates 40 million developers worldwide. But now PHP is between its own rock and a hard place. Its own Scylla and Charybdis. And I don't mean Guinness and Jameson. I mean something else. I mean Ajax on one end, which is that rich UI is eliminating the need for a templating language. Because you're doing everything in JSON, who needs a templating system? But PHP is an embedded templating language, so that advantage is disappearing. That simplicity advantage is no longer a big deal anymore if you're doing everything in jQuery or YUI. And then on the speed end, the rock or the hard place, the other end is the speed end, which is that PHP back then was always waiting on the database, so you never really need to worry about speed because the database was always your bottleneck. But with the introduction of Memcache, PHP now has to perform, okay? Because we're now instead of waiting on disk, which is what the database is, we're waiting on RAM, like Memcache. RAM is freaking fast, so now they're waiting on us. They're waiting on our code. And we have to make PHP perform. And that means introducing things like profiling, with XHProf or Kcachegrind, migrating to Apache or Nginx with PHP FPM, or using hip hop or whatnot. Unless you're me, because apparently I don't need to profile my code, I just command it to run better, or I just chuck in some semicolons and it'll improve the speed. So the second vignette, hip hop. That's the language needs to be performing part. Let's talk about that. Hip hop was written by a guy at Facebook. So Facebook still codes in PHP, but what hip hop does is convert their PHP code and compile it down into C, converts it in C++, and then they compile and they run the binaries, so they don't have to worry about the speed of the PHP engine because it's running in natively on the system. This is like how a just-in-time compiler works, but it's not in time, like in Java or .NET or JRuby. But it just converts it to C++ and executes. And the reason why is because of this, which is that PHP is not too memory abusive, not as memory abusive as Java, but it's certainly nowhere near as efficient as C++. And on the other end, in terms of CPU performance, PHP uses a hell lot of CPU. And then if you have it in C++, you're using almost none. So that's why they wrote hip hop. It's a lot of extra work because if you're Facebook and you have thousands upon thousands of machines, if you can tweak out an extra 10% performance on 1,000 machines, you just saved 100 machines on your co-location. But hip hop does maybe a little more. So this brings us to part 2, the what of this talk, which is there are 3 infrastructures I want to talk about of operations. The first is your infrastructure on a shared host. This is how PHP became big, right? One click, install on DreamHost or GoDaddy or whatever WordPress. I just go there, I literally click the WordPress button, install. And WordPress isn't that difficult to install from scratch. You basically unpack it, point it to your database in one page, and you're done, right? And that is how PHP became popular and ubiquitous, is because shared hosting was ubiquitous, and PHP is the easiest language on a shared host. But what's happened now is that they're taking away, unless your problems are mom and pop, which they almost never are anymore, they're taking away that. You can't do that on a shared host. You need to jump from a shared host to something bigger like managed hosting or co-location, and that is a gigantic jump. That jump is usually performed by your system administrators, by your site ops people that you hire. And what I'm saying is startups nowadays, they're taking that away from you. They're not going to hire a site ops person. That's the reality. And if you go this way, you're going to have to learn to live without your offensive line. And you do it wrong, you're going to look like last year's Steelers, where they basically didn't have an offensive line and got crushed by the Packers in the Super Bowl, because they all got injured right before. So we have to figure out all of this stuff as developers, which we never had to worry before. We have to automate everything. We have to put stuff on the cloud because they won't have, we don't know how to do capital expenditures for buying site servers, buying servers for our co-location. We can't manage all that. We have to eliminate the user testing and do more agile release processes like everyone else is doing. And we have to become more agile in hosting, and while shared hosting is the beginning for PHP, it isn't the end. The second concept is infrastructure is like a form of computer. This is how a modern high-performance site like WordPress.com or Facebook is written. It's built like a computer. Jason Hoffman at Joyent says the data center is the new box. And what I mean is like the CPU is like, your web server is like the CPU, and Memcache D is like your RAM, and database is like your disk. I mean, when you're doing this, you're basically structuring your site like like you're building a computer. And we're reaching a point where nowadays we don't have to build our own PC. We're not Michael Dell anymore in our dorm room building our PCs anymore. That shit is going to be built for us. We're just going to click some buttons in a configurator somewhere, just like we do when we buy Dell computers now, or Macs or whatever, and it just gets shipped from China to here. It's just going to be the same way with the data center. You're going to configure it and just go and hit a button. You're not going to have to manage that sort of stuff anymore or hire people to manage it. And we see the same thing today in the form of web services. We're increasingly dependent on more and more web services. That's infrastructure as a service, right? Which brings us to this cloud computing thing. Last year, Jeff Barr from Amazon gave a talk which has these books, which they're giving away, I guess. and host your website in the cloud. And he mentions the difference between traditional and cloud hosting. The big important thing is this idea of capital expenditure versus operational expenditure. You basically pay for this shit as you go, which is great because your website can now grow with you as opposed to not. So you don't have to anticipate your growth ahead of time and handle specialists to do that. And that's what infrastructure as a service is. And it brings me to the last vignette, which is Facebook Open Compute Project. So I want to revisit this data center as a box thing. And somewhere recently, last year, Facebook announced this thing called the Open Compute Project. And what is it? It's what they call open source data center design. So it's a bunch of jargon. And the big pieces of this open source design is that basically from a system administrator point, it's commodity hardware, and they added some power and cost efficiencies in the way these co-locations work. But I think the important thing to consider is, why did Facebook do it? Nobody does anything for free unless there's something in it for them. And Marco Arment wrote, he's the guy who wrote, what is it called? Instapaper. What he said is, it's usually in the business's best interest to commoditize its complements. And that's what Facebook is doing. So let me explain what that means. Okay? In this case, is if you look at this quote from Google, Google is saying basically they don't care that if the iPhone succeeds, because the iPhone, at least at the time, obviously with Siri they're trying to change this, is iPhone users drive usage of Google. So Google wins no matter what. And the reason they're doing Android isn't to dominate that market. It's to commoditize it, to make it a generic thing. They don't want Apple to control it because it complements their business, which is search. So they want to turn it into a commodity so that there are no players in there and they don't have to work with anyone. They want to just level the playing field and make it just the same. Whether that's the same thing Microsoft did to the PC hardware business. They turned it into a bunch of commodity business, and therefore Microsoft dominates in the software space because they commoditize the hardware space. Google does that with every application they give for free, right? They basically give it because it drives their search, and they want to commoditize it so that those applications, whether it's Maps or Mails or whatever, or in the case of Google Plus, is a generic thing. And that's what Apple does with apps on the App Store. They want to turn it into a commodity so that the apps are commodities and then you're still buying an iPhone to run all your apps. And he didn't understand why Facebook did it, but it actually is. What he doesn't, he wrote, but the benefits of commoditization in the area of Facebook are very small. My best guess is that this is primarily a recruiting of engineering talent. And he's wrong with that part. The benefit is to turn infrastructure into a commodity. That's the complement of what Facebook is doing. Facebook is in the social networking business. But they're dependent on this hardware and these large co-locations under these very special conditions to run such large instances. These whole data centers, like Apple buying a huge data center just to handle their cloud stuff. And they want to turn that into a commodity so that they can go anywhere. It's like Rockefeller and trains. Rockefeller had the oil business, and because it was so big and used trains for everything, he knew when the train monopolies were cheating him because he could see all their prices, and that's how he broke the trains, and that's how he ended up dominating oil. It's the same thing. Facebook wants to be free to move to any generic service out there. And that's what's happening to this market. So this brings us to how we're going to take advantage of this reality, which is there are 3 levels of application for your knowledge as a PHP developer. The first is infrastructure as a service. You can go, and now this area SiteOps these people are in, their skills don't translate as well as your skills to this market because you're now going to be programming these infrastructures. And therefore your skills as a programmer become a huge benefit. Whether you start easily with SliceHost, recently purchased by Rackspace, so this is like Rackspace Cloud. And you can do that. It's a little difficult because you have to start your own shit, like figure out how to use database, you know, install all this stuff as a sysadmin would have to do. And if you do that, you know, you're going to have to install your operating system and everything. Please, whatever you do, don't use Gen 2. That's my piece of advice. Because it's like being making a rice burner, you know. You don't want your operating system to look like this. It's like someone tells me that their computer is so fast because they recompiled everything with C flags -09 or something like that. Just don't. I mean, it's not going to be that big of a deal. Your life will be much easier if you don't do this. The next step up is Amazon Web Services, and there's a free tier which I think was announced last year by Jeff at SFPHP, and you can just do that, install. You basically get 1 year free of their smallest instance, and you can just develop on it. It's great, and so I recommend this to everyone. Just run an install of this and test it out, of EC2, which is their virtual server. And they structure their system in 3 tiers. And the tier I want you to focus on is the base. As you go down these things, you become more and more dependent on Amazon. You won't be able to move to a competing cloud service as you go on. So you want to, if you are doing this sort of stuff, you want to try to stay closest to the base system, because the base system will allow you to move to any cloud hosting service wherever you want to go. Okay? That's just a piece of advice. And what Amazon Web Services are is programmable infrastructure. That's all it is. It's basically your whole co-location is one big piece of software that you program. And there are dangers. This is CNN's quote from when I first gave this talk, the day of I first gave this talk. 365, I've had this problem before. Basically what happened is one of Amazon's colos crashed, and Reddit, Quora, Foursquare, Hootsuite, parts of New York Times, ProPublica, and about 70 other websites went down that day. That happened to me when I was attacked. 365 main went down. And it was more embarrassing, I feel, to me, because this was like in 2006 when Twitter was going down all the time, and I was getting tweets from people that my site was down. That was just totally embarrassing. You know, when Twitter is telling you your shit is down, you must be in a whole world of suck. The second level is to just not do it yourself, to actually build the services for other people to build their stuff. And examples of where we see that today is things like .cloud, which allows automated deployment. They're not focused on PHP, they're focused on everything. PHP, Python, Ruby, Rails, all of that crap. That's their mojo. Or obviously as a PHP developer you can specialize in PHP. That's what Orchestra does. And if you as a PHP developer want to run in the cloud, you should probably consider something like Orchestra. And Orchestra, if you want to know about it, this guy here at the alcohol, whatever, where you're going to get drunk and try to forget everything I said, well, go talk to him before you get totally shit-faced. Since they're going to pay for your alcohol, first of all. And second of all, because they have an interesting product. Basically, you install your code in GitHub, a private instance of GitHub, you point your code to GitHub, and boom, it's on. It's PHP code. And they support frameworks like Zen Framework, Symfony, Lithium, Solar, PHP, and Frappy. I'm not a framework person, but I'm sure a lot of you guys are. So their support is already built in, so you don't have to worry about that. They have things like job queuing, error logging, CouchDB and Memcache instances, and MongoDB instances. So they have a lot of stuff already. And they recently got bought out by Engine Yard, which is a Rails cloud system. Another example I found recently is Pagoda Box. It's a lot like Orchestra, except they don't do their stuff on GitHub. They build their own GitHub repository for you. MySQL database connection, they build for you, etc. They basically allow you to pre-build your PHP. You set a config file of what stuff you need in your PHP, and it just builds it out for you. And one of their big shticks is the first instance is free. So if you don't mind having it be like your appname.pagodabox.com, that's totally free for that one instance. So your developer instances are free, and then you pay like $10 if you want to have the domain name. You pay for larger instances or more instances on top of that. And I think it's pretty reasonable. I'm paying about $120 a month for SliceHost. If I were on PagodaBox, I'd be paying about, for the same amount of CPU, I'd be paying about $50 a month for the same amount of CPU and RAM that I'm using right now on SliceHost. And SliceHost was one of the cheapest out there because you have to roll it yourself. So it's a pretty good deal depending on what your needs are. Or you could go a level up. What ZippyKid does is they build their stuff on AWS, but what they only build is WordPress instances. So custom virtual WordPress instances for larger clients who are bigger than just a single blog. That's what they do. They're cloud WordPress. Because WordPress.com, the only time you get that in the cloud is if you're a VIP user, right? I mean, or you have the restrictions of the free usage on the .com site. So sure, if you're CNN or Fox News or Lolcats or TechCrunch, yeah, you're a VIP customer of our company. But where's that in between that and your mom and pop blog? Well, ZippyKid is trying to fill that in if you don't want to deal with the shared host because you need more CPU or more scalability. And so I want you to, if you're going to go into that, I want you to think of these things, which is you have to figure out how to add value to it. Add value to the programmer who's going to be using your site. Language specification, where you're language specific, that's going to be a value add. If your specialty of PHP, specialty is PHP, like Helgi is, you're going to attract PHP developers. And that makes sense why EngineYard would buy Orchestra, because they're a Ruby's on Rails shop. They don't know shit about PHP. So they need those specialists. Another example is one thing they offer is framework specification or optimization. Once you allow people to work in the framework of their choice, like ZF2, like these guys over there, then you can optimize ZF2 for your particular instance and give them a value add that way. Application specification in the case of ZippyKid, they specialize in WordPress. Exposing tools for development, optimization, deployment. Using different installs like PHP, FPS, or Nginx, or Hip Hop to have more performance that an average programmer isn't going to figure out how to do. If you can offer those, then you can carve out a niche that is added value to those users who are using your service. The last approach with this knowledge is to start here and finish somewhere. What I mean is that on one case, the examples I gave were a subset of this example, where programmers now operations is now a programmer. This new term is called DevOps, not site ops or whatever. It's called developer operations. And you could do that sort of stuff because there aren't many of them, and there's definitely a need for DevOps people out there. Or you could do a startup yourself. The barrier to entry now for a startup is so low it's unbelievable. Okay? It is incredibly low. You're now limited by only your imagination, not by your wallet. When I first started internet development, we needed a whole team of people to manage the colo. Teams of programmers, teams of marketing people, teams of everything. We started eliminating marketing people by learning about virality. We started eliminating support people by saying we can just release often enough. I mean, not support, but quality assurance people. We started outsourcing our support people, and now we're basically becoming our own developer now, or moving it to outsourced managed in the form of a company like Orchestra. So you can now do this stuff. You're only limited by your imagination. That's the side thing. And just remember, PHP was never about PHP. It was never about the language. Sure, without PHP, LAMP would just be lame. But But it's not, what attracted us to PHP wasn't the language, beauty or anything. It was that it was sucked. It was that it was simple and scalable and whatever the third one was, I forgot. Those three things are what attracted us to the language. That's what PHP is about. Take that knowledge and apply it. You know, a Java person says, look at it this way. Java's like a knife. A knife can do many things. A good one is essential for cooking. It can cut open packages, cut a cord. It really comes handy in a fist fight. Java can do a lot of things really well. And a PHP person would say, or at least I would say, if I have a fight, I'd rather have something designed to solve that problem specifically and solve it well, like PHP solves the web problem really well. PHP person says, yeah, that your knife is nice, but I'd rather have a gun. Okay. Oh, by the way, this picture was, I was taking a shower once and the shampoo bottle slipped out and gave me this big scratch here. I went to work and all these people were asking me, how'd you get this weird cut here? And I told them about the shampoo bottle and they were like, that's stupid. And no one was believing me, so I started telling people I got into a knife fight with a bunch of Ruby on Rails programmers. So, I mean, you're only limited by your imagination. You can do anything right now. And I really recommend that you do. And you make a lot of money off of it. So that perhaps someday you can throw 10K in the air and don't bother picking it up. Give some of it to me on the way back. And that last story I mentioned about hip-hop and the first story I mentioned about the John Henry C++ coder, that guy, his name was Hai Ping. And Hai Ping created hip-hop. It's named after him. And so he's there still trying to debate with me about whether or not C++ is good or not by reprogramming it so all PHP can run on it. It's a very interesting approach to that argument. So this is my contact information. If you have, and I'll be posting this talk to SlideShare. Also, the earlier versions of this talk are already on SlideShare. I really thank you very much for listening to me ramble on and on about this stuff. But I think it's very important. We're seeing a lot of commoditization going on. I'm actually worried that as developers, we're going to become commoditized because it's not as difficult as it used to be to make these websites. So you have to find a way where you can be creative because creativity can't be commoditized, or you can be what's high touch, you know, where you work on a personal level with people, because that can't be. If you're a Walmart greeter, you can't commoditize that job. You can't outsource that to China. But it's becoming increasingly more likely that the skills we have that are high skill can be outsourced. So you have to find ways to make your skill more than just the skills that you have and be more creative, because that creativity, no matter how much shit that comes from China, they still have to employ some designer in Scandinavia, I guess, to design that shit you buy at Target or IKEA, right? And think of it this way. No matter how commoditized site ops or programming or any of this stuff becomes, the guy who's creative, that job, the guy or girl who's creative, that job, that idea, that startup, that can never be outsourced. And now you can create that. Before, you needed gobs of money and a whole lot of luck. Thank you very much.